In September of 1964, the small community of Albany, New York, was shattered by a crime so vicious and profoundly brutal that seasoned detectives had only one way to describe the person responsible: a sadistic, murderous sex maniac. Catherine Blackburn, a respected 50-year-old foreman, was found sexually assaulted, stabbed, and horrifically mutilated in the sanctity of her own home. The investigation was massive, consuming the city as police hunted for the monster who did this. But every lead went cold, and every lead went cold, and every clue turned into a dead end. For over 60 years, the killer was a ghost, a spectator of pure evil, who simply vanished after committing an unforgivable act. But he made one mistake: a microscopic clue left behind in the chaos would wait patiently for 6 decades until science could finally unlock its secret and reveal a truth that was more shocking than anyone could have ever imagined. The year was 1964. The world was changing, but in Albany, New York, life for Catherine Blackburn was defined by routine and hard work. At 50 years old, Catherine, or Kate to her friends, was a woman who had carved out a respectable life for herself. She was a foreman at the Fuller Brush Company, a position that spoke to her diligence and character. She lived alone in a modest home at 117 Colony Street, a place she kept with pride. Catherine was separated from her husband, an Air Corps veteran working overseas in Japan, so she managed her life with a quiet independence. To supplement her income, she rented out an upstairs apartment. In the days leading up to her death, she had been busy. She had just canceled the newspaper ads for the rental and had spent part of the weekend giving it a fresh coat of paint, preparing for a new tenant. She was a devoted daughter, sister, and aunt, known for her kindness and her faith. Her love was ordinary in the most reassuring way, a calm rhythm of work, family, and home. But that calm was about to be obliterated by an unimaginable storm of violence. On the morning of September 14th, 1964, one of Catherine's co-workers arrived at 117 Colony Street to pick her up for their shift, but there was no answer. After waiting and calling out with no response, the co-worker grew concerned and contacted Catherine's family. Her niece, Sandra Carmichael, and Catherine's sister rushed to the home, a growing sense of dread settling over them. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found. The home that Catherine had kept with such care was now a scene of unspeakable horror. They found Catherine's body. She was nearly nude, her body brutally mutilated. When police arrived, the scene they documented was one of pure, calculated sadism. Catherine had been bludgeoned in the back of the head, fractured her skull. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been viciously stabbed and slashed. But the killer's depravity didn't end there. Investigators determined that he had gone to the kitchen, selected knives, heated them on the stove, and used them to burn grotesque marks into her lips and chest. The official cause of death was blood loss, but the reality was she had been subjected to a torturous assault by a predator who reveled in cruelty. The coroner, shaken, declared that this was the work of a sadistic sex maniac. Evil had entered Catherine's house, and for her family, life would never be the same. In the aftermath, the Albany Police Department launched one of the most intense manhunts in the city's history. Detectives swarmed the quiet neighborhood, desperate to find the phantom who had committed such a depraved act. They believed the killer was a stranger, a random predator, who had somehow crossed Catherine's path. This randomness made their task infinitely harder. There was no obvious motive, no burned lover or disgruntled acquaintance to immediately focus on. The initial investigation, working in an era before modern forensics, did remarkably meticulous work. They processed this crime scene with a level of care that would prove crucial 6 decades later, wearing gloves and preserving every fragment of potential evidence. They found bloody footprints in the yard and documented bloodstains inside. They also found several slips of paper that seemed inexplicably linked to the crime. One was a small scrap with the number 117 written on it, Catherine's address, as if the killer had jolted it down so he wouldn't forget. Even more tantalizing was a receipt book. A receipt had been torn out, but by examining the pen impressions left on the next sheet, investigators could make out a fictitious name in that same house number, 117. It seemed Catherine had taken a deposit from a man planning to rent her apartment. Had she rented a room to her own murderer? Police chased down every man with a name that could possibly match the impressions, but each lead was a dead end. It appeared the killer had used a fake name, another calculated move to hide who he was. Investigators pursued every possible angle, considering hundreds of potential suspects. The list even included Albert DeSalvo, the man who would become known as the Boston Strangler, as they explored connections to other violent crimes in the region, but despite their exhaustive efforts, nothing stuck. The footprints led nowhere. The blood samples without DNA analysis could only tell them so much, and just like that, the trail went completely cold. The sadistic maniac who had destroyed Catherine Blackburn's life and traumatized a city had, it seemed, committed the perfect murder and vanished. As years turned into decades, the memory of Catherine's brutal murder faded from the public eye, becoming another tragic unsolved file in Albany's history. But for her family, the silence was deafening. Her niece Sandra Carmichael, who had made the horrific discovery as a young woman, was now growing older, the trauma of that day forever etched into her memory. The family just prayed for answers, for the day the monster who had stolen their beloved Kate would finally be held accountable. They lived with the chilling knowledge that somewhere the man responsible was walking free. And he was. While Catherine's family grieved, her killer was just living his life. He was a man with a name, a history, and a dark secret he carried every single day. He moved through the world, perhaps passing by the very detective who had haunted him, a wolf hiding in plain sight. He had a violent streak that couldn't be entirely contained, leading to other crimes and stints in prison. But he always managed to keep his ultimate sin, the murder of Catherine Blackburn, buried deep. After serving time for other assaults, he was released and lived out the rest of his days quietly, dying in 1998 without ever having to answer for the evil he committed in September of 1964. For 61 years, justice wasn't just delayed, it felt completely denied. The silence was finally broken in 2018. The case of Catherine Blackburn, a long dormant, found a new champion in a determined detective named Melissa Morey. At the time, Melissa was in the Albany Police Department's forensics unit. She heard about the infamous cold case from her husband, who had been at a party with retired detectives, many of whom still spoke of the Blackburn murder as the one that haunted them most. Intrigued, Detective Melissa pulled the original case file. What she found stunned her. The file was a time capsule of impeccable 1960s police work. The evidence was all there, perfectly preserved and cataloged, just waiting for technology the original investigators could have never dreamed of. Around the same time, a powerful new alliance was forming. Dr. Christina Lane, a professor at Russell Sage College, was launching a cold case analysis center. Catherine's family, having seen a news story about the program, reached out to Dr. Lane for help. This fateful convergence brought Detective Melissa, Dr. Lane, and the FBI together, and they began a formidable new partnership. The team zeroed in on this physical evidence. After carefully considering crime scene photos and evidence logs, They identified the single most promising item, a handkerchief, found underneath Catherine Blackburn's body. It was a long shot, but it was their best hope. In 2023, with funding from the non-profit Season of Justice, the evidence was sent to a specialized private lab in Texas called Othram Incorporated. It is at the cutting edge of forensic science, specializing in a technique called forensic grade genome sequencing. Basically, they can take old, degraded, or minuscule amounts of DNA evidence once considered useless and build a complete, comprehensive DNA profile. Their scientists went to work on the handkerchief, and from the decades-old fabric, they successfully extracted a DNA profile of an unknown male suspect. For the first time in 59 years, investigators had a complete genetic blueprint of the man they were looking for. The ghost was about to get a name. With the full DNA profile in hand, the case was turned over to the FBI's elite forensic genealogy team. This is where science meets old-fashioned detective work. Using the suspect's genetic profile, investigators began searching public genealogy databases to find people who shared parts of his DNA. His distant cousins, great aunts, or third cousins twice removed. From there, they began to build a massive family tree, working backwards through generations to find a common ancestor, and then forward again, tracing every branch until they could narrow the possibilities down to a single person. The team reached out to relatives they had identified, who bravely cooperated by providing their own DNA samples for comparison, allowing investigators to further zero in on their target. The genetic roadmap eventually led them to one name, Joseph Stanley Nowakowski. The name immediately raised red flags. Joseph was born in Albany in 1931. At the time of Catherine's murder, he was 33 years old. And when investigators pulled his criminal record, the shocking truth began to crystallize. Joseph wasn't just some random man. He was a violent, career criminal who had been in and out of the justice system for most of his adult life. His record stretched back to at least 1950, when he was arrested for a series of burglaries as a teenager. The violence escalated as he got older. In the 1970s, he was convicted for a brutal assault on an elderly woman in the nearby city of Schenectady, attacking her with a hatchet in her own apartment. The parallels to the Blackburn case were chilling. After serving time, he was released from prison in 1980 and, for the most part, stayed off the police radar until his death in 1998. The profile that emerged was not a mythical monster, but of a real-world predator who lived right there in the community he terrorized. He was a man with a documented history of violence against women, a man who was in the area at the time of the crime, and whose DNA was now the leading candidate. But to be 100% certain, investigators needed one final, irrefutable piece of proof. To get that final proof, authorities took an extraordinary step. They petitioned the court for an exhumation order. In September of 2025, just over 61 years after Catherine's body was discovered, police investigators gathered at Albany Rural Cemetery. They unearthed the casket of Joseph Nowakowski. From his remains, they took a direct DNA sample. The sample was rushed to the lab and compared with the DNA profile built from the handkerchief. It was a perfect match. After 61 years, the ghost had a face, a name, and a grave. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski was, without a shadow of a doubt, the man who had brutally murdered Catherine Blackburn. On October 8th of 2025, the Albany Police Department held a press conference. Standing before the cameras, Police Chief Brandon Cox announced that the city's most infamous cold case was finally solved. But the most powerful words came from the woman who had carried the weight of this tragedy for over 6 decades. Sandra Carmichael, now 81 years old, stood with her family and spoke through tears, her voice filled with a lifetime of waiting. 61 years ago, evil entered my aunt's house and changed our lives forever, she said. We prayed for this day. To all who made this possible, God bless you. For her and her family, It was a miracle. It was the answer to a prayer that had spanned generations. It wasn't the justice of a courtroom. Joseph had escaped that by dying. But it was the justice of truth. The world finally knew who was responsible. The resolution of Catherine Blackburn's murder is incredible proof of the persistence of a few dedicated individuals and the relentless advancement of science. It's a promise that no victim is ever truly forgotten. The meticulous work of detectives in 1964 who preserved a crime scene with foresight they couldn't have fully understood laid the foundation for a breakthrough they would never live to see. A determined detective in 2018 who refused to let a cold case stay cold breathed new life into the investigation, and the brilliant scientists of today who can turn microscopic traces of DNA into a killer's identity provided the final undeniable answer. The shocking truth wasn't that the killer was a supernatural monster, but that he was a man, a violent, predatory man who walked free for decades. While he is beyond the reach of earthly justice, the confirmation of his identity has closed a 61-year chapter of pain and uncertainty for Catherine's family. His DNA is now on file, and investigators believe it's possible he could be linked to other unsolved crimes. But for now, the case of the sadistic maniac is closed. The memory of Catherine Blackburn, a woman defined by her kindness and diligence, can now be honored with the peace of knowing that the truth finally has come to light. If y'all find this story of persistence and justice compelling, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into cases where the truth, no matter how long it takes, finally prevails.